She was sent to a cowboy against her will. She never expected to be loved like this. The snow came early that year, a beginning that felt more like judgment than weather. It arrived in thin, clean sheets that filled the hollows and seamed the land shut. Hollow's Fork, a town named for a hollow that never really held anything but rumor, took its winter on like grief, folded, silent, precise. People moved with the economy of those who know how to conserve warmth, hands in pockets, heads down, breath a white string in front of their faces. The river froze in strange patterns, and the hills looked as if someone had run a white hand across them and left everything changed. Mariam was sent under that white sky. They wrapped her in a blanket because decency required at least the semblance of it. They placed a wool cap on her head and tied her wrists with cord more symbolic than safe. The clerk read names from the ledger they kept on town business days, and every name sounded the same: accounted for, allocated, priced. It was a market of neat edges, farm produce, cattle, a tractor, and that day, a woman's right to remain on land. The auctioneer's voice had the flatness of someone who spoke in transactions. "Sold," he said, and the word fell through the cold like a stone into deep water. Mariam had 4 thin layers on, and a single stubbornness beneath them all. She had been a woman marked by small, fierce refusals for as long as she could remember. She had also been unlucky in the arithmetic of people: father dead, brothers distant, a creditor whose patience had turned into ledger lines. There had been a sickness in their roof of care, and the house was taken to pay for the debts that had never considered tenderness. For the town, the arrangement was tidy. For Mariam, it was betrayal wrapped in paper. Reed Callahan stood at the edge of the square with the kind of distance men acquire when they are used to measuring things by their weight rather than their shape. He wore a dark coat good at reflecting cold and a hat that had been molded by many winters. Reed's hands were broad and had earned calluses in the rough arithmetic of rodeo years and hard soil. He had a face that rarely needed words. Years of weather and teeth gnawed by long silences had given him the sort of expression other people noticed only when they were in need of someone who would not hurry away. When the gavel fell, his jaw did not move much, but he stepped forward. The men in the square filed paperwork. The clerk balanced the books. Coins passed and changed hands. Reed bought the claim on the farm. It wasn't dramatic. There were no gestures, no speeches about justice. He slid cash across the crate, bent like someone who knew the value of low motions, and said, "Not for sale." That small phrase was an armature. The town would later write it down as some sort of grand mercy. But what Reed did on that wind-hardened day was not mercy made of spectacle. It was the measured economy of a man who decided at that moment to carry the weight of a thing another had chosen to drop. He did not pretend he knew everything about her or that he had a plan. He only knew what he disliked seeing in the square: a woman counted as an asset. They wrapped Mariam in a blanket and took her out to the ranch that night. The house was low and smelled of coffee and dog hair, of leather warmed by the stove. Outside, the sky was hard and the snow was quiet. Reed led the mare into the barn and put her in a stall where the horses stamped and huffed to keep warm. Mariam watched him with a kind of careful anger not at this man who had bought the claim, but at the world that had required a purchase to stop the marketplace. "You okay walking?" Reed asked, not as a flourish, but because the question had to be asked. "No," she said. The word was small and true. He led her to the kitchen and sat a bowl of thick broth in front of her. The broth was simple, made from the bones of a steer and spruce of old, and it tasted like something remembered. Reed draped a blanket over her shoulders with hands precise enough to be respectful. They did not speak much. The night kept the house small, the roof of it, the stove, the single lamp that hung like a hesitant sun. Sleep, when it took her, came as an exhausted surrender. She woke in the deep dark, and there was a man at the table with a cooling cup of coffee. He did not ask too many questions, and that might have been the first kindness. The choice not to pry where prying would have been cruelty. He only said once and clearly, "You got a name?" "Mariam," she answered. He nodded as if the name settled something. Names were the currency of small towns, and to be given one that was not a ledger entry was the smallest kind of reprieve. That winter hollowed the time into bare acts, stabling, mending, a small economy of food and sleep. It was the season that taught them both, in its way, how to live with shortages. Neither of them spoke of love as if it were a thing to be purchased or won. The ideas that would arrive later came slow and awkward, and were often misread and mismeasured. For now, there were edges to fit into, a blanket folded just so, a bowl warmed with careful hands, a door shut against the cold. Reed's ranch was a place of habits. Winter made of it a slower machine. Chores were the counterpoint, simple motions that gave shape to the day, mending harness, breaking ice for troughs, feeding grain with the predictable rhythm of hands. Mariam learned to fill a pail and keep her footing on frozen porches. Her fingers, which at first moved as if remembering a quicker and more brutal way of being, learned the work of attending to living creatures again. She found herself talking to Mercy, an older mare with a patient, knowing face. Mercy breathed on her hands and nudged them like an argument for trust. People in Hollow's Fork had opinions like coats, many, and worn in public. They watched from the market and the post office and in the corners of saloons where talk ran warm against the cold. They spoke of the auction as if it were some unbreakable law. They said, sometimes politely and sometimes crude, that a woman bought was still a commodity. Reed heard them and barely reacted. He would stand at the fence when the town's gossip came within earshot, and in the same way a wall holds ground, he held his silence. This was the thing that began to do the work love elsewhere only pretended to do: steadiness. It turned up in the small observations, the tiny, repetitive mercies. Reed found himself moving in ways he hadn't planned, picking up bread because she liked the crust done a certain way, making a small improvement to the stove, knowing before she asked when the child needed warm socks. He kept to tasks, but his shape changed by involution. Where he might once have kept to his own affairs, now his days included another's small needs. For Mariam, the daily labor was a therapy. The barn became a place of practical confession. She learned how to wrap a wound on a horse leg, and in doing so found words for the soreness in her own hands. She mended fences and, in the way of stories, repairing splits in the world gave her the sensation of repairing herself. It took time. It is always the slow thing that proves durable. The rawness of being auctioned dulled into a scar that changed how she walked, but did not wholly define her. There were darker notes, days when a townsperson would make a remark, and the old nightmares would wake. A writer from Hollow's Fork once came with a ledger question, and when he spoke too close to Mariam, she felt the old thing tighten in her chest as if the world had come near with a hand on her throat. Reed stood between them, not with flair but with the steadiness of a hand on a fence. He told the rider to move on, said it so flat it might have passed for boredom. He did not need to raise his voice. The hard line in his face said enough. The rider left with a muttered curse, and the town continued to keep its own counsel. There were softer things also, odd, absurd moments that make themselves into the scaffolding of the heart. They shared the first snowfall unremarkably, beneath a lean-to where Reed banged a nail into a board and she fed the dog. They ate stew with their hands warmed by the bowl. Once Reed taught Mariam how to splice a rope in a clean corner of the barn, and she found that the motion steadied more than just the rope. It steadied the pulse of a life that had been hurried along by other people's choices. One night, when the wind made the rafters sing like something mourning, Reed sat by the stove and told Mariam about a woman he had loved years ago. Brief sentences, small facts, a name dropped like a stone into the middle of a running stream. She listened and did not pry. The truth of him, once hidden by laconic exile, came out in pieces. She was the woman he had married and who had died in a winter 12 years before. He spoke of her taste for lemon in tea and the way she'd fold clothes a certain way. His memory of her was quiet, intimate, and the soft tenderness with which he spoke, it made Mariam feel less like an acquisition and more like an addition to a life that still held echoes. They moved together through the winter like people who discover they can carry more when they shoulder some of the load. Reed's kindness was not flamboyant. It was not a rush of grand gesture. It was practical, mending seams, warming sheets, listening if she wanted to say anything, and retreating if she didn't. In time, Mariam found herself leaning toward him as much because it was convenient as because it soothed. Human attachments often begin in smaller economies than passion allows, and when two people have been exposed to losses the way Reed and Mariam had, tenderness takes a different shape. It is often a thing of reserve and caution, partial gestures proffered to measure the other's boundaries. Their first kiss was not cinematic. It happened by the barn light after they had hand-wrapped bales. It was tentative, awkward, and startling in its ordinariness. The barn smelled of hay and the warmth of horses. For Mariam, the kiss felt like an invitation she did not expect to accept. Then she accepted it, and another world shifted its axis a fraction. Winter insists upon memory. It folds time into itself until things that have been hidden return like cold wind through a seam. Hollow's Fork had a way of keeping accounts like some people keep prayers. Everything must be balanced, sometimes at the expense of mercy. A messenger arrived with papers, old claims pulled from a drawer, signatures dried with age, legal language that assumed women were things to be counted. The message was plain. The prior creditors claimed the settlement had been reversed in the auction's confusion. They demanded she be returned and the balance settled. Reed read the paper with the dispassion of a man who reads weather, necessary and unromantic. He had no illusions about law and how it sometimes spoke in odds and ledgers, not in truth and heart. He folded the paper slowly and set it on the table as if the paper itself might catch and freeze. Mariam watched him from where she stirred porridge. The stove gave heat in an economy she'd come to trust. "What do they want?" she asked. "To collect," he said, a word stripped of flourish. The town men paraded their indignation with more volume than sense. They voiced the law and the righteousness of transactions and the need for tidy books. 24 hard men, men whose patience was measured in cattle and who had little taste for complication, came on a night when the moon was a thin coin and the stars were knife bright. They carried lanterns and torches. They stood at Reed's gate with the sort of righteousness that often precedes violence. There was a lot of talk about claims, papers, rights. There was very little talk about the person at the center of it. Reed stood at the doorway. His gun hung on the wall, but was not his first argument. He did not shout. He simply unfolded life. In the day that followed, he rode into town and, in the presence of witnesses, paid the debts that accounted for the property in questions. He signed his name on a paper and placed a pen under hers and asked quietly if she would sign too, an act that was, in the legal sense, a reconciliation of accounts. In another sense, it was his way of making a bond that had no market, an affirmation of belonging that was not transactable. The men of Hollow's Fork grumbled, but could not easily overturn a simple fact. Money had moved in the open. To them, Reed's action was puzzling. Why would a man burden himself with the messy cost of somebody else's misfortune? Reed replied not with explanation, but with action. He paid. He took the ledger into his own hands. The town did not leave that night quietly, and turbulent consequences followed. A shot rang out as Reed tended Mercy's stall on a late afternoon, sharp, cold as a vow cut into the air. He fell, and snow darkened at his side with blood. The world tightened to a clean, bright instinct. Mariam dragging him to the barn, the smear on her hands, the feverish work of stitches, the sleep spent watching the slow rise and fall of him. It turned out the wound was not fatal. It was a hard lesson both for Reed and for the town. Your act of protection sometimes costs you, and those costs will echo into long nights. But the wound also did a strange thing. It flattened a number of the town's pretensions. Men who had a taste for counting found that you could not account for courage in their ledgers. Reed's body mended in the kind of way that makes a person quieter and more patient, but that also hardens a resolve. Mariam sat by him through nights when he muttered his late wife's name, and in the middle of that fragile sleep discovered how much she had come to mean to him. Violence, the kind that is measured with a gunshot, often tries to settle old accounts. Reed's response settled a different type. A ledger of belonging measured in daily acts. He did not refuse the cost he chose to take. If anything, he made it the thing he carried when morning came, mending the wound's scar tissue with ointment and kindness, making sure the child wore dry socks, and bringing the dog in from the cold. The winter burned slow, but left a new rhythm in the house. The town's roar receded like tide. People who had once declared her fate now greeted Mariam with a reserved nod or a softer gaze. There was no triumph, only a sense that things had been reset, not by law, but by the stubbornness of people who choose each other again and again. When spring was an idea on the horizon, they planted a few trees, apple saplings, green even when the ground had only just thawed to dark mud. This was how people build futures in places that have been hard, in increments, in firings of patience. Reed and Mariam worked together on the ridge where the air tasted of thaw and the sky went broad. They spoke rarely of the auction and the names that had violated her life. Instead, they spoke about grafting branches and how to protect saplings from rabbits. The banality of such speech had a sanctity to it. It meant the future would not be paid for with rhetoric, but by daily care. Love, when it arrives in the wake of loss, is rarely showy. It is a sequence of decisions about small things. Reed learned to do them. He started fetching wood early in the morning, so the house would be warm by her waking. He learned the exact temperature she liked the bread baked to. He held the reins with 2 hands in a way that gave the horse and the rider safety. Mariam, for her part, learned to trust hands that had been awkward with softness before. She discovered that trust can be a muscle, strengthened by repetition. They had a child whose noise reassembled a lot of the quiet late nights into laughter, quick, insistent, uncompromising. Parenthood, as it tends to, rearranged rooms, literal rooms and rooms within the self. Reed became clumsy with tenderness, in ways that made him almost tender to watch. Mariam surprised herself by learning lullabies she had thought she had lost. The house filled with small, daily proofs, stained aprons being washed gently, the dog's head always somewhere near a pair of tired feet, a spoon put away in a drawer without being asked. One evening Reed surprised Mariam by driving the sleigh to the river, by a place where the ice had a thin sheen and the willows hung their pale hair like curtains. He had wrapped a small, oilcloth bundle, and when he opened it, inside was a coin, dull with age and worn smooth in one place where fingers had rubbed it. He told her the coin had saved him once, an emblem of a winter where he had nothing. He offered it to her then, not as currency, but as a pledge. "I carry this not as proof of anything grand," he said. "I carry it as a reminder that we can be small-lived and honest. Take it if you'll have it." She accepted with the simplicity that must be the hardest thing to learn, to be given something and to not make of it a debt. They kissed with the hush of 2 people who'd learned the humility of belonging. That night the child slept between them, and even the dog seemed to breathe easier. The town, begrudgingly, made room for such life. Gossip is a weather that eventually shifts. All climates do. The women in the market softened. The men who had been quick with ledger speech darkened their faces with something like mutual recognition. But the truest acceptance in Reed and Mariam's life came in quieter forms. The way the child learned to run to the gate and throw arms around Reed's legs. The way Mariam folded a shirt and slid it into a drawer because Reed liked it neat. The way when a storm came they both understood which supplies to count on and who would check the traps. There was no grand pronouncement, no cinematic standing in the storm moment. Their version of love lived in utility. It was in the decision to stay the night in the hayloft when the wind looked like a beast. It was in the small way Reed would hump his shoulder against the wind to shield Mariam as she climbed into the sleigh. Such acts, over the years, were stronger than speeches. They were the ledger they kept together. Years lay over the ranch like rings in a cut tree. Each winter a layer, each spring a promise of green. Children grew, and the orchard they had planted yielded small fruit. The house slowly accumulated things that mean having lives. A kettle with a dent, a hymn book with coffee stains, a quilt that had been pieced from other quilts. Reed and Mariam learned to be unexceptionally content, which in a world that measures drama by fever, is perhaps the rarest kind of miracle. Time, though, will bring its own tests. One winter a fever moved through Hollow's Fork with a particular quiet viciousness. It took old men who worked too hard and a few babies who were too small for such troubles. Reed and Mariam tended the sick with the stubborn patience of people who had been keeping others alive for years. They gave what they could. Broth, hands, a presence that did not pretend to be magic. The fever took someone dear. There were losses that stitched grief into the house. But the work of survival made the community knit tighter. Men who had once had nothing to do with each other brought up wood and sugar. There was an unglamorous heroism in these small mutual acts. Reed found himself in the doorway of the town's makeshift infirmary, handing a blanket to a neighbor and then turning home to make sure the child had another pillow. In one of those long nights, when the world reduced to stovelight and the breathing of those who needed to be watched, Mariam took out the small coin Reed had given her years before and turned it in her fingers. It was smooth as memory. She slid it back into the drawer with needles and a folded scrap of paper, an old letter she kept private. The kind of thing you read for proof that people have been generous once and can be again. She pressed the coin to the child's forehead like a blessing and whispered the single instruction she hoped would be enough for a life: be stubborn and be kind. As the years went by, Hollow's Fork told its version of Reed Callahan's story. That he had once bought a woman at auction and, against reason, kept her. Storytellers tacked the moral on however they thought helpful. Sometimes he was a fool, sometimes a saint. They left out the small things. How he learned to braid hair clumsily because Mariam liked it. How he would wake at midnight to fetch her a blanket. How they would stand together on the porch when snow fell like paper confetti and they would not speak but only hold hands. The true ledger of their life was simple and uncompromising. Reed had once carried the cost of a human life as if it were measured in coin. Eventually he learned that the only ledger worth balancing was the one that records daily care. Mariam had been sold against her will and came to the ranch bearing scars. She found something unforeseen, being loved in a manner that had nothing to do with the claims and papers of men. It was not a dramatic redemption so much as a durable one, love as a routine, love as a tool chest. In the end, there was no single sentence that encompassed what they had, only a series of small entries in the days: warm bread, steady hands, a child's laugh, a coat hung up when the wind was bitter. On the coldest nights, they still stood on the porch and watched the snow hush the hills. The dog slept at their feet, and the child, now growing, would come out to press a mittened hand into theirs. Reed's voice in those hours was low, and his sentences economical. "We did the small work," he might say. "We did," Mariam would answer. That exchange did not redeem the world. It did not right every injustice. It only bore witness to a more private kind of justice, the one that insists belief in another person is a type of labor, and that honoring that belief is what makes houses into homes. In a life built from a harsh buying off and stubborn loyalty, in a winter that had tried to keep everything brittle, they had made something that warmed. When people in Hollow's Fork tell the story of the woman who was sent to a cowboy against her will, they sometimes expect a tale of revenge or great melodrama. The truth is quieter. She was sent into the world like many things that are meant to be used, and in time she was given something no ledger could buy: the daily, stubborn, patient work of being loved by a man who chose her again and again, not because the law required it, but because his own standards of decency did. He loved her with the kind of love that isn't always loud, the kind that arrives in the mornings, stacks wood for winter, mends holes before they become cold. If you ask Mariam at last what changed her, she will touch the coin and say, as if naming a simple weather, "He stayed." And perhaps that is the most accurate ledger of all.